Listen, I watched 4 episodes of Lassie before I figured out why the little hairy kid never spoke. I mean, he rolled over, sure, he did that fine, but I didn't think he deserved a series for that.
Ben, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. This better be good. I was flying. It was so real. I was over this giant circuit board or something. I drew as much as I could remember, and I'd like you to take a look at it tomorrow, okay?
I tied into my father's computer on the modem and filled in some details in your drawing.
What's it doing?
It's programming itself. It's asking for coordinates on X, Y, and Z axes.
It's pretty solid.
Can you make it bigger?
Sure.
I didn't know it could get that big.
In this force field, you have no inertia, no resistance to acceleration. You can start, speed up, stop without slowing down, and basically, you won't get squished.
Here's the thing I thought we should use.
Oh, it's perfect. We can all fit in here, too.
Once we get this built, how fast will it go?
Well, imagine being in a car and accelerating from 0 to 90 in less than a second.
I christened thee the Thunder Road.
See them flying there? That's what they call a traveling map.
Hey, man, I waited a lifetime for something like this to happen. I want to find out what the hell it was we saw up there. Gordon, there was something inside. Didn't you see it? I swallowed my gum.
Let's face it, somebody's calling us.
They've been calling us since the beginning.
But from where?
Explorers would hit US cinemas on the 12th of July in 1985. It wouldn't arrive in the UK cinemas until December of 1986. That's nearly 18 months after its initial release. Directed by Joe Dante, who had become a well-known director for his work on Gremlins the year before. Explorers cost in the region of $25 million to produce, and even had George Lucas's effects company, Industrial Light and Magic, help finance the film. Unfortunately, the film bombed big time in the USA as it arrived the weekend of Live Aid, so everyone pretty much stayed at home to watch the event on the Saturday, ignoring the film, and it only recouped $9.8 million domestically, and it was up against stiff competition from Back to the Future, which opened 9 days prior. It's unclear how much the film managed to crawl back in box office receipts worldwide, but it was seen as a failure for Paramount Pictures. The reviews didn't really help it, with average scores across the board from the critics, with the majority complaining of the disappointing ending. Rex Reed for The Hollywood Reporter was brutal, saying at least the boys were able to get their contraption off the ground in the film, which is more than this monstrosity is likely to do for Paramount at the box office. On the show At the Movies, Gene Siskel gave the film the thumbs down, saying the film wasn't bad, but there wasn't enough of a payoff for when you get to outer space. Gene felt it was made quickly to follow up on the success of E.T. Roger Ebert also gave it the thumbs down, complaining about its inconsistency in tone, as it becomes a parody when the kids arrive in space, feeling the aliens were a stand-up comedy act, resulting in a dumb ending. A number of critics knocked it for the first half feeling like a Spielberg film, and the second half very much a Joe Dante one, which Joe understood. But Joe Dante was never happy with the process of making Explorers. He had to deal with a tight schedule, and with Paramount Pictures moving the release date forward by a month, he was kind of screwed. Joe said years later, "The problem is for me is that the movie you'll see is not the movie I wanted to make. It's the movie I got to make up to a certain point, then had to stop. It's hard for me to look at it. It's not the film I quite had in mind." Ethan Hawke was so disappointed that no one liked the film when it came out, with the hostile reviews. Ethan felt that he let down Joe Dante, feeling responsible for its failure, and only told him years later at a film festival. Joe was shocked Ethan had taken any responsibility for the film's failure, and reassured him it was not his fault. Despite the poor box office and the drubbing it received by the critics, Explorers would eventually find its audience on home video, where it would become a cult classic. though not treated well by Paramount Pictures, with a limited release on Laserdisc, with no widescreen presentation, though the DVD format would present it as intended. Thankfully, Shout Factory would eventually release it on Blu-ray with a wealth of extras, making it the best version to own of the film. For over a decade now, with filmmakers' love of all things 1980s, Stranger Things would have similar traits to Explorers. Even the key poster art for the film would in many ways represent on a visual level what Stranger Things is all about. The writer of Explorers, Eric Luke, had been working in LA in a bookstore called A Change of Hobbit in the early 80s, which was visited by fans of science fiction and famous authors of the genre, so he would end up socialising with many of those with a similar interest, and he soon began developing ideas to write his own script that would capture his childhood and love of all things science fiction. He funneled a lot of his own experiences, personality and love of outer space into the story. He managed to secure an agent, and the script, which was only around 65 pages at the time, was shopped around to a number of studios such as 20th Century Fox, who didn't understand it, but soon talk began to build up around Hollywood of a script that captured the magic of E.T. Getting down to the wire, producer David Bombick liked it, and it was sold to Michael Eisner of Paramount Pictures, with the help of David Kirkpatrick, who got personally involved with the production as he understood and appreciated the script. Paramount Pictures had eyes on Wolfgang Petersen to direct, after being impressed with his work on The Never-Ending Story. Writer Eric Luke and David Kirkpatrick flew over to Germany to meet with Wolfgang, and they watched The Never-Ending Story. But Eric and David felt the film didn't have an American feel to it, and the logistics of moving the production over to Germany would be a challenge, as they felt it would be hard to replicate that American nuance in a foreign country, as detailed by producer Edward Feldman in Starlog issue 95. They felt Explorers wasn't the right material for Wolfgang. Wolfgang had no hard feelings about it, and they parted ways on good terms, and Wolfgang went on to make Enemy Mine for 20th Century Fox. David decided to speak with Steven Spielberg, and asked him who he would recommend to direct Explorers. Only one name came to him, and that was Joe Dante. Joe had an office at Warner Brothers, and a script was sent to him, and he read through it quite quickly, and handed it back to the Paramount Pictures rep and said thank you. They thought he wasn't interested until the following day he phoned them back and took the job. Joe Dante loved the premise, but felt it didn't have much of a third act. What Eric originally wrote for the ending was that the kids visited Mars and discovered this alien race who were dying, and the aliens wanted to pass on their secrets to them. But another race of bad aliens had turned up to steal their knowledge. Joe didn't like this approach, so instead suggested the idea of when they get to space, they instead meet alien kids. The ending was constantly evolving, with the kids at one point meeting the aliens and playing baseball with them. Paramount executives said, "We can work on it while we are making the picture." Eric would end up producing 3 drafts with additional input from Joe. Joe Dante said during this time there was a glut of kids who were trained to be very polished and come across as slightly phony child actors who had this lovable Disney-like approach to their performances. He felt they were kids you wouldn't want to stick around to watch for 90 minutes. It was difficult for him to find child actors to be just kids on screen and not professionals. Ethan Hawke plays Ben, the heart of the team. Ethan came in from an open casting call. He had no experience, he had braces on, and he was a bit awkward. He tested with a bunch of other kids like Corey Haim and Corey Feldman. They felt Ethan had a great face for the film. His personality fit the role of Ben, and he got the part, making him the lead actor of the film. Ethan reflected years later, saying many kids had difficult times being actors, but he had 2 great mentors growing up, and that was with Peter Weir and Joe Dante. Joe loved educating the kids on film history. Jason Presson plays Darren, the mechanic of the team. Jason was very shy at the time and very private, but bonded with River and Ethan. Jason had already worked with 2 big actors, Robert Duvall and Glenn Close, in The Stone Boy in 1984. Jason would work with Joe Dante again, having a small role in Gremlins 2, acting alongside composer Jerry Goldsmith. Jason would retire from acting in the late 90s to become a hospital nurse. The late River Phoenix plays Wolfgang, the brains of the team. River tried out for the role of Darren, but Darren had already been cast, but they wanted River in the film, and offered him Wolfgang, as they felt River had great range. River didn't really like the idea of being a science nerd, but he took the part and gave it 100%. Being 13 years old, he would spend hours practicing how to walk differently and change his mannerisms, showing at that age his dedication to acting. Amanda Peterson plays Laurie, who Ben has a crush on. Amanda had previously had a role in Annie in 1982. After Explorers, her career was mainly focused on TV and stopped working in the industry in 1994. She unfortunately passed away in 2015 due to an accidental overdose of morphine. James Cromwell plays Mr. Muller, Wolfgang's father, who is also a scientist. James has appeared in many big movies such as Eraser, Star Trek First Contact, LA Confidential, and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. Dana Ivey plays Mrs. Muller. Dana is a familiar face of the big screen, appearing in such movies as The Colour Purple, The Addams Family and its sequel, Home Alone 2 and Rush Hour 3. The highly talented Robert Picardo plays as the alien Whack and his father, and as Starkiller in the cheap B-movie At the Drive-In. Robert would have a larger role in Joe's next two films with Inner Space and Gremlins 2. Robert had just appeared in Ridley Scott's Legend as Meg Mucklebones under thick makeup by Rob Bottin, so Robert was used to working under these conditions, making him ideal to play the aliens. A regular of Joe Dante's films, the late Dick Miller plays as Charlie, a helicopter pilot, who may have also received messages from outer space when he was a child. And writer Eric Luke would have a small role in the film as Darren's teacher. He would have more screen time in the deleted scenes, and only appeared with his back to camera in the theatrical and home video cuts. Filming commenced in October of 1984 and they finished in February the following year. Joe knew he had a tight schedule with the original release date set for August, but another issue was with the kids' availability. As it was shot after the summer, they only had them for 4 hours of the day and couldn't use them for night shoots. During the summer you had them for 6 hours as it was out of school, so to help avoid any delays they would recreate the locations on a set to simulate the nighttime settings. Another problem arose for Joe was when the studio changed hands in the middle of production, with Michael Eisner leaving for Disney and Frank Mancuso moving up the ranks, and he decided they needed the movie much quicker than they already scheduled. So Joe had to move fast with shooting on sets when the paint was still wet. Joe said the kids stepped into the spaceship, they sunk into cement because it wasn't dry. Ethan would also end up breaking his foot as he tried to ride a motorcycle and fell off, and had to have his foot in a cast for 3 weeks, messing up the schedule. With Joe being a film buff and having lots of love for 50s B-movies and pop culture, he would litter the film with many references. Ben is obsessed with aliens and movies, and the film opens with him having the War of the Worlds on TV. The children attend the Charles M. Jones Jr. High School, named after Looney Tunes director Chuck Jones. When the boys are hovering over the drive-in, the film that is playing stars a space hero named Starkiller, named after George Lucas's original last name for Luke Skywalker. And the sound effects from the movie are from the Atari video game Yar's Revenge. And Whack the Alien, his first exchange of dialogue is of Bugs Bunny's famous catchphrase, "What's up, Doc?" And the alien's whole interaction with the kids and video sampling would be a wealth of pop culture history. The editor Tina Hirsch was good friends with Joe Dante. She had worked on the Twilight Zone movie, Gremlins, and he wanted her to edit Explorers, but due to the time crunch, she couldn't do the whole picture, and delivered the first rough cut, which was around 3 hours long. The studio made the boneheaded decision to push the release date forward by a month to July, which made it so stressful for Joe that he considered quitting. But he decided not to in the end, as he didn't want to let the kids down. They test screened the film to a large audience of all ages. The kids in the audience were on board for the whole concept. The adults, however, didn't go with a change in tone for the third act. As Tina was no longer available to work in fine-tuning the film, editor John Wright, who went on to edit The Running Man, Speed and X-Men, to name just a few of his credits, would work on fixing the final cut, but Joe needed more time to make it work. But the studio just told him to stop editing, and they had decided they were just going to release it, as they had the perfect release date in mind, thinking they were going to make a huge amount of money. There was about an hour and a half worth of footage that was left on the cutting room floor. Shout Factory included in their Blu-ray release around 30 minutes of deleted scenes from a VHS work print. Joe did try to find the other material but struggled to locate it. These scenes from the VHS copy really expand upon the other characters. The bullies who harass Ben, Wolfgang and Darren at the beginning have more screen time, with the kids getting their revenge on the lead bully at the end. You get to see Ben's entire family outside of just seeing his mum. You find out his older brother is at the drive-in pointing out the wobbly effects. The romance between Ben and Laurie is given more time to develop. During the screen test this romantic subplot was heavily reduced, which Joe regretted. The ending was different, with Ben communicating with Dick Miller's character through the TV, and Whack tells him to visit his living room to find the spacecraft. Joe said the deleted scenes give you a good idea of what the film might have been, but not what it should have been. Joe didn't have the time to find the movie he wanted within all the footage. He needed another year. For the film's plot, during the storm, Ben is experiencing a vivid dream about flying through clouds and over a vast city-like circuit board. He suddenly wakes up from his dream and he draws a diagram of the circuit board with intentions to show it to his friend Wolfgang, who is constantly bullied for being a nerd at school. Ben gets into a fight and is saved by Darren. Darren becomes friends with Ben and they head over to Wolfgang's house, who has now built an actual microchip based on Ben's drawing. They discover the chip enables the generation of an electromagnetic bubble. With a number of tests, they realise that the bubble is capable of moving at near limitless distances. and speeds without ill effects from inertia. Thanks to Darren's access to a junkyard, and with his mechanical skills, the three boys construct a rudimentary spacecraft out of an abandoned tilt-a-wheel car and name it the Thunder Road. After a successful flight test, despite being spotted by Charlie in his helicopter, who begins doing his own investigating, the kids all begin receiving vivid dreams of the circuit board and realise the messages are coming from outer space. They finalise their plans and prepare to explore the galaxy in search of alien life. As Joe Dante was not happy with the theatrical cut, he had another opportunity to make some additional cuts for the home video release and TV version, which is a few minutes shorter but has a slightly different ending. The scenes removed include Ben and Wolfgang walking to a school and discussing the strange dreams, and instead just cuts to Ben getting beaten up and meeting Darren. They removed the scene of the kids chasing after the tilt-a-wheel car as it rolls down the road. The crystal-like device Ben is given by Neek, in both versions it glows in Ben's class. The theatrical version cuts to the circuit board, then we see the kids flying, but the home video release, it cuts to an empty class with the Thunder Road in the corner. As he looks inside, it cuts to the circuit board and then the flying sequence, etc. During the end credits for the theatrical version, Whack breaks the fourth wall, but the home video cut, he just tells another joke. So not much of a difference. Given the severe deadline, the making of Explorers proved to be a mad race against the clock to complete. With ILM on board, they would complete 140 different visual effects shots, making use of highly detailed matte paintings, blue screen opticals shot on VistaVision film stock, miniatures, and with the use of motion control cameras, plus CGI. Omnibus Computer Graphics were asked to design and animate 2 elaborate dream sequences set in a computer landscape. The company had previously contributed animation effects for Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Joe said in an interview with Cinefex magazine, "We initially went with computer graphics because we wanted the sequence to look a bit different, but we didn't want them to look like The Last Starfighter or Tron. Not that those pictures look bad, they got such flack because that look was expected to carry the entire picture. But what happens is that after a while, the novelty of these effects begin to wear off, as you get used to seeing it. In Explorers, computer graphics are used sparingly enough to stay interesting." In creating the creatures for Explorers, Rob Bottin realised from the start that they were not meant to resemble the typical cinematic extraterrestrial. They did not, for instance, need to have the grace of the aliens in Close Encounters, or appear to be terrifying as the xenomorph from Alien. These aliens had to represent a different strain of intelligent being, the couch potato. They weren't originally couch potatoes from outer space, explained Bottin. In fact, in the script they were described as having very demonic faces, and looked almost like grasshoppers with 20-foot long legs. But when Bottin was told he only had 2 or 3 months to create these creatures, Rob stressed to the producers, "You don't get 16 legs in 3 months. Rob told them not to worry and said he'll come up with something. Besides the fact that Whack and Neek had to look different from other screen aliens, both creatures had to be able to speak a considerable amount of dialogue, and Whack in particular had to be able to move around a lot. As a result, Bottin realised that mechanical puppets would prove not to be the answer, so he decided it was best to use actors in suits and go way out there with a makeup design that would be nothing like anything anybody had seen before. Both Whack and Neek proved difficult to light on the set, largely because when the creatures were lit only from above, the eye stalks tended to cast a shadow over the middle of the aliens' faces. The answer to this problem was to add a fill light from down below, but positioning such a light on a set in scenes involving the kids and the numerous operators was difficult to do, and required multiple takes as they had no preparation time before shooting. The visual effects throughout are generally very impressive, some ambitious shots, especially during the 80s having to deal with photochemical effects. It's the high quality you come to expect from ILM. Of course, when dealing with blue screen opticals you have the obvious matte lines in places and slightly faded footage, and the flying sequence at the end showcases these limitations, not looking quite as convincing as Supergirl from the year before, which made use of front projection. The aliens are certainly very original with their design and are brought to life extremely well by Robert Picardo and Rob Bottin's team. They kind of look like they belong in a kid's cartoon like Galaxy High. Remember Galaxy High? I loved that show as a kid. Explorers showcased a wide variety of visual effects that complement this story that starts out small and slowly builds up to an epic space adventure. And when it comes to stories like this, ILM were the best for the job. Jerry Goldsmith composed a score to Explorers. Jerry provided a score to all of Joe Dante's films bar The Howling. Joe's first instinct in the score's direction was to tempt the film with Bernard Herrmann's Walking Distance music from The Twilight Zone, which Joe recalls in the liner notes of the soundtrack. He remembered Jerry saying, "Do you really want it to be this sad?" Joe said, "I don't want it depressing, but it's a movie about dreams that don't come true. It's a movie about learning what you think you're going to find in outer space. Isn't this great revelation? What these characters find is a reflection of themselves, and they find that space is not the place to look for what life is all about. So there was a sense of loss about the movie that I wanted to get into it, but Jerry also managed to do a lot of bouncy stuff that made it a lot more fun. Jerry Goldsmith characterises the bubble and the aliens' influence and technology with a wide variety of electronic effect sounds that are glassy, crystalline and magical. They were all synthesizers, recording engineer Bruce Botnick says. In those days we didn't have samplers, and they were all played live, so there was usually 3 to 5 keyboardists playing live in the room. This was before we were using MIDI to trigger any of those parts being played. At the recording studio they didn't have any acoustic echo chambers, like they had at Warner Brothers, where they recorded the scores to Gremlins and The Twilight Zone, so they made use of echo plates, highly strung with transducers, and that was the echo they used. Their goal was always to create enough air in the mix to be able to have these synthesizers sound like they were part of the orchestra and vice versa. Joe said Jerry Goldsmith came close to saving the movie. The score was everything they wanted the movie to be. It was one of Jerry's best scores. Joe said further, "I thought it certainly did its best to lend coherency to a movie that had large pieces missing." The score came out on LP and cassette around the time of the film's release, containing 40 minutes of music with a mix of Jerry's score and some pop songs. It would get re-released on CD in 1990, and Jerry's complete score would eventually get published in 2011 in a limited run from Intrada Records. The score to Explorers is fantastic, wonderfully playful and creative. Jerry during this time was experimenting a lot with mixing electronic cues with a full orchestra. He managed to create this perfect blend of the two. I think everyone's favourite track is the construction of the spacecraft. It's just epic and so memorable. Just the act of seeing these kids make the craft in the woods, the music just gives it this wonderful sense of adventure. I love the end credits music, which on the album is called Have a Nice Trip, which makes use of the wacky electronic cues for the aliens that would fit so naturally to a kid's cartoon. Then it switches to an epic space opera score. As Jerry did Supergirl the year before, there are some similar cues in places that have a familiar sound. If you are a big fan of his work, you might be able to hear the little moments if you listen carefully. It's definitely one of his key scores that highlights his incredible work during the 1980s, and perhaps the best score he did for one of Joe Dante's films. It's a shame they don't do scores like this anymore. A must-own soundtrack. Now this may surprise some of you. I didn't grow up with Explorers. I never saw it in my local VHS rental store. I don't recall seeing it on TV. I'm sure it did get broadcast a number of times, as some of my friends have nostalgia for it, but there are many like me who didn't see it. Explorers never came out in the UK on DVD, bizarrely, hitting store shelves in parts of Europe and the USA, and it wasn't until the Blu-ray from Shout Factory I got to eventually see it. Madness, but true. So going into it, I didn't have any fond memories of it, and watching it fresh at an older age, I thought maybe the film wouldn't really connect with me, but thankfully Explorers was really charming. Great performances from the lead cast, perfectly scored by Jerry Goldsmith, and had great effects by ILM, but I share similar concerns to what most of the critics said at the time. Once the kids meet the aliens, it trips up, leaving you a bit disappointed, and the ending comes across as very confusing. The premise of Ben receiving messages from outer space and straight away discussing his thoughts with Wolfgang to begin developing the circuit board does feel very sudden, as we are introduced to these characters and the film was already in full swing to get to the core idea, that these kids are going to have the opportunity to travel far distances and into space, discovering the perfect vehicle within 30 minutes. The film doesn't beat about the bush and gets straight to it, which avoids any sort of pacing issues, but because many scenes were trimmed, characters are introduced and don't have any payoff, and the connection between Ben and Laurie is painfully cut short. Now, watching this not knowing what was cut until after the fact, the film still generally works. As it cuts the meat out of it, it solely focuses on the three kids, as they begin to work together to figure out what the dreams mean and how they go about their plans to travel into space. As an adult, watching three kids lead an entire movie could be off-putting, but because they give very natural performances, it makes them very easy to watch, and it starts to tap into your own nostalgia as a kid, as you and your friends would construct something in the garden, or tapping into your imagination to live out your own adventures. Filmmakers of the 1980s really seemed to find the perfect balance at designing movies for kids that would appeal to the adults, mixing adventure and nostalgia that captures a perfect moment in time. Dick Miller, who was always great to see in Joe's movies, in Explorers his role isn't particularly well written despite being cut short. He spots the kids flying around and begins his own investigation. He tries to quiz Ben, but he runs away. We discover Dick's character has also been contacted in his dreams as a kid, but that story thread goes nowhere. He spots them taking off and he's gone from the movie. To me, it seemed pointless writing this character if they weren't really going to do anything with him, or say have him join the kids, so they feel somewhat protected by an adult, and having Dick Miller along for the ride would have been great anyway. Once we find the kids on board the alien craft, it becomes visually very interesting as they make their way through the tunnels and avoid the various obstacles, and encounter Wack, who leads them to the big screen room, where the film comes to a grinding halt. As Wack begins this comedy act doing impressions and full-on karaoke, as the kids just sit there and watch, the downside is that it's not really that funny. You see Ben starting to look confused, very much like me watching it. Ben realises how disappointed he is in what he finds, and maybe that's the joke of it all, but you just end up annoyed like Ben. It's the movie's biggest issue. There's not much dialogue for this sequence, other than Robert Picardo ad-libbing his lines as this montage of clips play out. Most interesting revelation is that we discover that the aliens are young teenagers like Ben, Wolfgang and Darren, as their ginormous dad walks in really pissed off as they stole his spaceship. This little moment is where it works best for this sequence. You get some connection there between the kids and the aliens. I think the film needed more of that. I can totally sympathise with Joe Dante, struggling to get this third act corrected and needing more time to make it fully work. Once the kids return to Earth, Laurie can now see the boys returning home in her dreams, as beforehand Wack sees a picture of her, and Ben says, "One day she'll be my girlfriend," and Wack responds, "Maybe sooner than you think." So Wack appears to have sent Laurie audio-visual messages of what's happened, and she sees them crash and goes to see if it's true. She doesn't say anything to them, but watches them from afar. We then see the boys perhaps the following day, or maybe a week later. It's not made entirely clear, but they feel depressed as the aliens haven't contacted them. The film wants us to feel a sense of loss for the kids and their new alien friends, but because we don't really get to know the aliens outside of their love of Earth, and the time they share with them is just taken up with a karaoke number, their friendship isn't really solidified to get the audience to have an emotional connection. The following day at school, Laurie sends Ben a note saying, "Have a nice trip," implying she knows what's happened. Then the device Ben was given by Nick, which they say is the stuff that dreams are made of, but what does that mean? I don't know. But then it starts to glow, then suddenly he finds himself flying over the circuit board and then into the clouds, not alone, but with his friends and Laurie in her nightgown. It doesn't make any sense. I remember sitting there just thinking, did I miss something? What is going on? It's supposed to be a dream they are all experiencing at once, but it's really weird. And you can tell they couldn't get the message across to make it cohesive. Things just haven't been explained properly. Explorers is a strange one because the first and second acts are really enjoyable. It's very Spielberg with its tone, and it's full of Joe Dante's style and humour, which is a perfect recipe. But with Paramount Pictures rushing it and the ending not being fully finalised while shooting, it becomes unstuck with its narrative and the connection between the aliens and the boys. It doesn't make the film bad in any way, it just results in a lukewarm finale that needed more of an emotional angle and the device that Ben is given to be fully explained. In the deleted scenes, things are still unclear, which is a shame, but it's still worth watching because there's a lot to enjoy, but the payoff at the end is not straightforward. It's unfortunate Joe Dante didn't make the movie he wanted, but what we are given has many strong elements that don't really tie up by the end, but I think the journey it takes you on is worth it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to click the like button and hit the bell to be notified of my latest reviews. Big thanks to my patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. If you want to get involved and gain access to exclusive videos and take part in Q&As, follow the link below.